Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio.
Okay. Saundra Gilliard, a professional storyteller and personal transformation leader, founded Femininely Free in 2019. Although the company was formally launched that year, it was 20 years in the making. The seeds of Femininely Free were planted when Saundra began to take notice how women were marginalized and overlooked in the corporate environment. Witnessing how overt gender bias was in the workplace, she began to develop an interesting in understanding how the biases played out in the social and cultural arenas. Understanding how persuasive narratives and stories are in shaping perceptions, exceptions, and beliefs, she honed in on the necessity to reframe the stories and narratives about women. She launched Femininely Free to ignite a movement through coaching, teaching, and storytelling. She hopes to disrupt gender bias and deconstruct the patriarchal system by reframing the narratives that define women and the feminine.
Okay, so welcome to the show, Saundra Gilliard. And okay, here's the really big burning question. You said in the intro that I just read that Femininely Free was 20 years in the making, and at the point where you actually incorporated and started as a business in 2019. What was the 20 years? What happened?
hmm So the 20 years, to dock at the beginning, I was watching the way that women were treated at that time in a corporation that I was working in. Very progressive corporation. Women were beginning to ascend the corporate ladder, but I noticed that there were some slight differences between the treatment of men and women. And at first, I thought maybe it was just my position, my vantage point. But then as I began to move up in the corporation, I noticed that I was experiencing what I had been seeing. And I didn't know whether or not it was just germane to that particular company or whether it was widespread. So I began to talk to other women who were in professional male dominated environments. And we began to share the same stories. So I am a storyteller, and I thought, well, how could I put this on the street so that women can begin to hear what they're saying and begin to analyze that? So in 2020, I wrote a play entitled Stories from the Sister Circle. And it was a play that I call folkloric drama, but it was stories that women were telling. And the play was so successful, I figured I had something in terms of women wanting to tell their stories about what it meant to be a woman in our society. And as you know, most of the stories that women are told through the fairy tales or or some
Right.
television program that was not written by women, but were written by men. And they tend to include, all the stereotypes about what it meant to be a woman. So you had men telling women what it meant to be a woman, and then women adjusting those perceptions. And from that, women started contacting me and wanting to know how could they start to tell their stories. So I actually started from a storytelling perspective of having women learn how to tell the stories that they were experiencing. I think 10 years down the road, it clicked for me. If we can tell the stories that we're experiencing, then we can begin to retell stories or change the stories that we were experiencing. And prior to that, I was doing change management in corporations, and I began to look at what was the formula I was using to get companies to change the way that they dealt with their employees from a culture-wise, and I began to do that on an individual basis. That's when I began to look at storytelling as a tool of transformation. But, the connotation of storytelling, someone says, well, what do? You sit in front of a group and you read a book, or are you going to tell me about Cinderella? So I really had to delve into understanding how to get people to learn how to break down their lives and story structure and begin to make those changes. So I spent about 5 or 6 years trying to hone in on that art. My performance piece, I took the entertainment performance piece and put it alongside a science piece and came up with the methodology of using stories to reframe and redirect your life in a transformational way. So that was my long history of looking at how are stories impacting our lives to now really learning how to hone in on using story as a transformation tool.
Right. So on the story and the most of the stories that because I have a daughter, and um everybody would say, "Oh, you're going to treat her like a princess." I said, "No, I'm going to treat her like the warrior princess that she should be." And they're like, "Well, what do you mean by that?" I said, "Well, first thing that goes out the window is this conception of Disney."
Yeah.
When you bring up Cinderella, because you brought up Cinderella, right? The Disney story of Cinderella is not exactly the European story of Cinderella, because Cinderella was, because of her stepmother and her two stepsisters, became a very strong person and was able to take control along with her. She was equal to her prince, right? Um,
Well, I'm glad to hear that you were able to break it down that way.
yeah.
And that's because of your background. We spoke earlier about how you are already in tune into looking at the human condition and finding more meaning. Most
Hmm.
people don't do that. So most people that have read either the traditional Cinderella story or the Disney's, they see two things. They see a woman who is mistreated
Hmm.
by other women
Hmm. Hmm.
who are jealous of her because of her beauty,
Right.
and they treat her so bad, so that solidifies this notion of women are jealous of each other.
Right.
And then there's only one guy, one text, who's going to take her out of that, this prince.
Right.
And all the women are fighting to get the prince who can take them out of their misery and
So,
put them in a place of comfort. And so you see the story of Cinderella mistreated by women, because we're so bad towards each other.
mhm.
And she finally gets to a place where she wins the heart of this prince who redeems her, and now she lives happily ever after. That's the story that
Mm.
most people remember. Even
Mhm.
my own daughters, we talk. They wanted to be a Cinderella,
Right.
so they don't think about the other messages, morals in that story. because the story that I just described is the one that is supported by
That's what's
social.
supported by our society, right?
Exactly. And so
Yeah.
that's the one that gets drilled in. The one that's
Mhm.
supported by our social perceptives, our actions, our behaviors are the stories that get drilled in.
Right.
So there are plenty of stories, but not plenty. There are plenty of ways that you could look at some of these stories and find a redemption tale, but it's not supported by
Well,
anything. So little girls are not going to remember that. They're
okay.
not going to remember, oh, Cinderella was victorious in the end. She got even. There's nothing that supports that unless they have a father like you who, who would make sure that
Yeah.
they got that message from that
Yeah.
story.
Okay.
And
So
that's the danger of having a story told over and over again with no redemption value.
okay. So I'm gonna because one of the things in impoverished areas, right, that they that the story is there's only one way out, and um, we're both people of color and basketball. Yeah, you got to play basketball. That's the only way that you're going to get out is because you got to you get it is for you to keep shooting hoops until you find the NBA. And how many times does that actually happen in our society where the control says there's only this one little path. If you can't thread that path, you're done.
But you know what though? It only has to happen once. And you know who they keep playing in front of these little black boys? Michael Jordan.
Mhm. Mhm.
They're not thinking, wow, that's the same person over and over and over again. They're looking at the prestige of being a basketball player. If you take the 20 basketball players who've made history, and I'm not a sports fan at all,
Yeah.
but if you look at, let's take 20 basketball players who, to the millions of black boys, they all know the same one, and they
Right.
all think that they could also have that dream.
Yeah.
There are far more PhDs. There are far more doctors. There are far more lawyers, but you don't have that story penetrating
Right.
the community.
Well.
They see the story of this ball player who, and some of them come from meager means. They come up, they rise up, and they see the wonderful. But there are so many doctors, lawyers, PhDs, teachers that have done the
Okay.
same thing.
So I'm going to point out two women here, and their story is not the norm. Camilla Harris,
Okay.
Condoleezza Rice.
Mhm. But their story is going to end up being the norm.
Well, here's the thing is both of them one PhD in political science and that's how she got to be um, Secretary of the State Department, right? That's how she got
Yes.
to be there,
Yes.
right? With George Bush.
Yes.
And Joe Biden picked her because she was a fantastic Kamala Harris because she was a fantastic lawyer,
Mhm.
not only a prosecutor, and then she fought hard for what was the latest thing the anti-lynching law.
Mhm. Mhm.
She fought for decades
Mhm.
for that law.
Mhm.
Of course, she was going to be, but the thing is those who want to control
Yes.
try to erase all the work and
Yes.
and just say, well, see, she only had this
Well,
one narrow little path in there.
well, look at Kanji, who was just made appointed to the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
Harvard. Yeah, I mean, she's a brilliant woman.
Hmm.
But here's the thing: they are still three black women,
Hmm.
women of color. And if you look at look at Anita Hill when she had the
Hmm.
with Clarence Thomas.
Yes.
You see the way she was dragged through the mud,
Yes.
cast aside. because she challenged patriarchy. She challenged the treatment,
Right.
and I don't want to get into politics here. I know that that's not our role here, but
No, no,
the story of it,
no. It's their
as a
stories of
black
how
woman,
they
as a
got
black
there.
woman,
Yeah.
because now you have the Me Too movement, which is a totally different complexion,
Yeah.
and now men are getting nailed to the cross.
Yeah.
And now they're going back and looking at, could she have been right? Was there some validity in her story? With Kamala, you have the same thing. You have people who are now, talking about her, as a woman. Whether or not she's fit. Not it has nothing to do with her intellect. Whether or not she can serve to be a wonderful vice president. Whether or not she's capable. Well, look at some of the vice presidents we've had. The only difference is that, they were not female. So she doesn't
Okay.
have,
The
it has to
to
be,
that may I say that I think Kamala Harris, outside outside of Joe Biden, okay,
mhm.
who has become president, um, that she's probably one of the smartest vice presidents I've I've seen. It's like um, I I guess I could toss in George Bush as being one of the smartest because Ronald Reagan because he had Alzheimer's, um, that actually turned out that George Bush was the one actually running the country at the time, with Ronald Reagan being in front. Um, but let's face it, there's been some really, like, not so smart vice presidents, right?
Well, politics aside, I try to look at the story of it. And
Yeah.
so, what is the storyline for my daughter, for my granddaughter, for little
Mhm.
girls of color, in terms of coming out of the Cinderella syndrome.
Yeah.
You just mentioned, and look, listen, my mentor is Shirley Chisholm, who started it
Oh.
way before either of them came. And she would
Yeah.
say one of her favorite quotes was, as difficult as it was to be a black woman, running for that office, she
Mhm.
had the biggest problem being a woman.
Right.
A woman, and it's because of the gender and the biases that we have living in a patriarchal society, and so that women are discredited for their intellect, their gumption. Men are confident, women are called the B word. Women, when you're
Yes.
aggressive, you're not ladylike. So we have all of these things that we have been stories to us
Mhm.
that we have ingested, and we begin to act like women. Well, the definition of women didn't come from women. It came from how men perceived us to be compared to them. And
Okay.
philosopher Simone Du Bois, I think her name is, she talks about women becoming the other. So we only become the other than the male, and everything about us is stories based on how you see masculinity. So it becomes an issue of femininity, the being feminine and masculine.
Right.
And because women are considered to be feminine, and not all women are feminine, but even men who take on feminine traits are downgraded. It's almost as if there's something wrong with a man who can tap into his feminine energy. We
Yes.
are we are bipolar people, okay? All of us have masculine, all of us have
Yes.
masculine and feminine tendencies. However you describe those. We both are capable of having both. We are socialized to be indifferent. And it just so happens in a patriarchal society, that socialization, it makes the scales unbalanced. So if you have more feminine attributes, which means that you're soft, you're caring, you want to be collaborative, you want to
Mhm.
go and
Mhm.
flow, you don't want to be as competitive. Well, that says that those skills are no good. They're less than good. But when you're masculine, aggressive, you're he-man, you're competition, then that means that you're good. So what happens is that we live in a society that is unbalanced, and for women to succeed, we take on the masculine role. When you have women who are trying to climb the corporate ladder, uh, you have to find a way to fit in to the old boys club. And it's just recently that I'm seeing that companies are realizing that they have to look at some of those other qualities, in order to be successful. Times are changing, and that old slogan in the 60s that you've come a long way, baby, we're going even further. So times are changing, and companies are beginning to realize that there are some qualities about the feminine
Mhm.
that makes the company run smoother, that makes the team work together better. That there's nothing wrong. We have
Ooh.
this whole notion of emotional intelligence now, and a
Yeah.
lot of them, have come to the conclusion that it's okay to show feminine energy.
Okay. Sorry again for the sports analogy, but it it fits. The masculine version of the superstar team, right? Is exactly that. They has a superstar. Get the ball to the superstar. Always make sure you pass the ball to the superstar, right? The feminine team, and I will point out that a feminine team a has that feminine let's work together quality, has won championships in sports, and
Uh-huh.
the only reason I'm using the sports analogy is because of the team.
Yes.
Okay, they have won the Stanley Cup. They did win the World Series. They have won the World Cup. Whatever it is that you want to do, your favorite sport in that direction. And the reason why they won wasn't because, hey, my man over there, or my woman over there has an opening to make the goal. Get the ball to her. It's like,
That win.
right. Hey, in the corporate situation, you know what? She's going to totally identify with this particular client. So I want her to be the team leader for this project because it's going to make the client feel comfortable,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
And instead of, oh well, I'm going to put the guy in there that's just going to rack up the points. It's like,
Mhm.
no, it's not a matter of racking up the points. It's a matter of all working together so we all come to a common place, right?
Mhm. Yeah, your analogy reminds me of a book I read, The Athena Doctrine, and the name of the author escapes me right now. But they talk about that. They talk about
Mhm.
how the companies that are now beginning to look at and measure and promote those balanced energies, those balanced skills, are the companies that are succeeding.
Right.
So it's true. We are balanced people. We need
Mhm.
to be
Mhm.
balanced. And as women begin to enter into male-dominated environments, you see the changes that have to happen. Is it easy? No. And I think a lot of time, not only is it not easy because of the systematic barriers, but it's also not easy because women haven't learned to tell themselves their own stories. So we've learned to ingest, when we go into companies,
Mhm.
um, learning how to be successful as defined by the masculine. We
Right.
one of the syndromes that came out, I think, in the 70s, it was called. People were concerned about the queen bee syndrome, and that was a syndrome where women who would get into management positions or leadership positions will be extremely hard on other women who were not in those positions. So there was not a lot of mentorship, a lot of coaching of the other women, and it was considered, a pathology. And the question became, but these women were doing the same things that men were doing, and was it expected that women should behave differently towards other women because you have that women to women connection?
Mhm.
And for a long time, you would hear women say, "Oh my God, I don't want to work for her," because they were thinking. Because the thinking is that if you work for a woman, that you would get that different type of leadership, and that wasn't always true. That women that have adopted the male way of leading and the male way of succeeding is going to behave like a man in that environment.
Right.
And so those are things that we have to be able to interrogate the stories that we were told about what it means to be a woman, number one, and then number two, begin to analyze how are we showing up in the world as women who were informed by men.
Right. So, okay, how does your story define you as a person? You'll eventually get to the woman part, but I went the person first.
Yeah, and so because I look at everything as a story, our I have one of my quotes is that I used to perform under the name Mama Sandy, and one of my taglines as Mama Sandy was that stories are the treasures that we find in life experiences.
Mhm.
So our whole life is nothing but a story.
Mhm.
And that story unfolds based on the stories that we are told and the experiences that we have to either support or dispel those stories. Lucky for me, I grew up in an environment where I was told stories from the social um, spectrum, and I was also told stories from my nuclear. And so the stories that I told was told to me from the nuclear gave me the agency to challenge the stories that I got from social perspective. So, for instance, um, you hear stories that I heard stories that you know uh, black children are inherently not as smart as white children. You know that's the story. That's the social story.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
my
Yeah.
home story, combated that. I was consistently, W.E.B. Du Bois, Thurgood Marshall. I always had in my
Mhm.
house
Mhm.
things that come, so that I never brought into that story, you know.
Yeah.
And then I recognized that if I can do it from that perspective, can I also do it from the perspective of being a woman? And then I began to challenge, like for instance, if you're strong, aggressive, and smart, you're not ladylike. Well, you challenge that because you start to see women like Shirley Chisholm and Barbara Jordan, and you start to see these women who are very, very, very intelligent and aggressive, and still a woman. Or you start to dispel the stories of real women are soft and la femme. Well, there are that's not true because all women are not soft in the film, but they're still women.
Mhm.
You start to hear, as you start to disrupt stories for myself, is that you can't be aggressive and still be a lady. And I don't believe that, Uh, I am aggressive, however, I'm not, I wouldn't say that I am as aggressive as from the masculine standpoint, but I am aggressive. And that's the quality that I don't make any, I don't try to hide. What I've come to realize is that, people are people. And when I start defining myself based on a label, I came more into myself and learned how to live life on my own terms. And that's what storytelling has helped me do, define who I am and then live life on my own terms. So it doesn't make a difference to me who thinks that my behavior is feminine or masculine.
Right. Have you self-labeled yourself?
No, I'm still I am a black woman unapologetically. And I say that because, the stigmas of being the black woman,
Right.
the angry black woman, the strong black woman. We are at the bottom of the total pole of most stories that are told, you know. And I know enough to know that there have been black women have carried this country. I know enough of that. So when I hear those labels, they don't bother me, because I know that that's not my origin story.
Right.
So I help women. The women that I help are women who have brought into um, the story of the. I'm not a religious person, but the Bible story about God made Adam, and then He made woman as this as the helpmate, and depending upon what your religious um, affiliation is or who tells the story. Eve, the woman, that some people, and even though she's not the first woman, some people look at her and go, she was the standard for all women. So being submissive, she was the curse. She damned the whole human race because she ate that damn apple. And the whole, everything that she's done. And then men have this notion of women should be home taking care of the house, um, and the children. And then we saw what happened to women with the pandemic because of that. Who came home to take care of the kids. It was women. So women lost their job not because they were the great exodus, because they didn't have anything else to do. So a lot of them, left their jobs not because they were going to start some wonderful major businesses, but because the pandemic didn't give them any other choice. When the kids came home, mom came home for the most part, because that's what society expects you to do. There are those few occasions where men have stayed home, but for the most part, society expects that if mom's home, if the kids are home, mom's home. That is the way it is for right now, and we see the impacts of that when you look at what happened to women in as we call the C-section, since the pandemic. But when women begin to understand, wait a minute, where did these roles come from? Does that still fit for me right now? And then begin to take a stand and say, no, it doesn't, and define what that new role is going to be and learn how to live in that new role. That is the story in your life, being able to break down what you have been told and really realize what really works for you.
Right. Okay. So how does that woman that you work with start to realize what does work for her, so she can keep that and dispel the parts that don't work?
Mm-hmm. Well, everything comes from self-awareness. So no matter, you have to know where you are right now, okay, and how you got there, because then you know what patterns you have to change, what beliefs you have to shift, and what new actions you have to take. And so that we become what we think we are. And when you begin to say to yourself, I'm more than this, well, first of all, you have to understand, what do I really believe about myself? And how many of us really wake up in the morning and go, what do I believe about myself? That's not something we do. We just take for granted. Everything we lived in through, everything we heard from our parents, everything we learned in school, the church, whatever, we just take it all in, and we live our lives accordingly. But
Mm-hmm.
when you could stop to say, okay, so I want to stop and think about what stories have been a part of who I am.
Mm-hmm.
And where I am now, is this the me I want to be? So to give you an example, you hear stories of women who, at the age of 60 or 70, just filed for divorce because they did not have enough strength to do it prior to that, because that's something women don't do. That's the
Right.
stories that they were told, you know. And when they get to the point where they just can't live their, and they look at life, there's only a couple of years left. I really don't want to live like this. But they get this notion that there's got to be something different. They begin to write a new story. So it's like, when you take an assessment of where you are right now, how'd you get there, and then where you want to go. And what Family Free does is walk you through that process. I work with ambitious women who are frustrated, overwhelmed, burnt out, and tired of working overtime, double time, to get their jobs done. We are still in the process where women are unseen and unheard, and environments where their opinions are just discarded.
Mm-hmm.
We still live in that society. And
Mm-hmm.
these are the women who have come now to a burnout, and they want to know what else is there for me. Number one is, do you have to leave your job? No, you may not have to. You may have to learn how to approach it differently.
Mm-hmm.
If you were taught to be polite, maybe that's not the place to be polite anymore. If you were taught to wait your turn, don't speak up. I've sat at meetings in a consulting job that I worked at, and I would say something, or I'm talking, and so one of the men would just butt in. You know, um, Women are not taught. Society doesn't tell us to behave that way, but men is okay. And the women that do that, they call them aggressive. It has a negative term when it's given to women, but it's confidence when we're talking about men. So women have to, be able to say, "Oh yeah, I am aggressive," and and keep it going. So you don't stop
Right.
because of the label. You know.
Yeah. Okay. So you talk about a process. Um, can you walk us through a little bit of that process? How you start to change these women's stories?
Okay, so as I told you before, life is a story,
Mm-hmm.
and you want to understand what your origin story is. So that's self-awareness. You want to understand where you are and what stories have you been told, to believe. And that story could be around money, your ability and your right to have money. That story could be about your ability to lead, your ability to speak up, speak out, those kinds of things. Like what were you told, and what was the feminine spin on that? You know, um, and we look at how was that story uh, reintroduced in society practice, and like what do you do? What are the limitations that we have that reinforces that story?
Right.
And so once you understand that this is something I've learned, okay. See, none of this is you. This is what you've learned.
Mm-hmm.
And when you learn that this is something I've learned, and it also has been reinforced, the
Mm-hmm.
first thing we do is learn something differently and begin to challenge those reinforcements.
Mm-hmm.
So you take a woman, let's take myself. You take a woman who felt that, in the back, I graduated from Villanova in '85, and I went straight, and I was, doing management, change management, and I went into a consulting field, and I was happy to be there, and my team was all male. And I'm always concerned about what I wear because I want to make sure, the old adage, you can't get them upset. You don't want to look too sexy. You don't want to do this. So every day for me becomes a struggle in terms of what am I going to wear to work. You know, we go out to eat dinner. The guys order drinks, but I'm always concerned. Well, I want to be ladylike. I'm not going to drink so. I'm always concerned about this image that I have, and it's not them, but it's something that I've learned that women don't do X, Y, and Z. After I found myself in terms of story, I begin to question that kind of behavior, and I'm at a point now that I wear whatever I want. I look the way I want. I know that now the bottom line is, can I do the job? And that becomes more important to me than to be concerned about whether or not I'm fitting into my corporate uniform used to be 2-inch black pumps, a pencil skirt, double-breasted jacket, and a string of pearls. That was my corporate attire, but that's not me at all. I mean, I tend to be more, more flamboyant than that. I tend to not to have that kind of. But that was the corporate attire, and for women, it was even more restricted at that time. We're now in a place where, women can feel freer to dress the way they want. And that choice is, do you dress the way you want that allows you to still do the job well, or are you dressing according to either one, protection or reputation? Are you dressing for you or for something outside of you?
Right.
And women tend to have that more than anyone else. So we talk about that. Who are you dressing for?
Right.
When you're doing that. And so it's making those kind of checks. And when I'm doing things, am I doing it for me, or am I doing it because it's expected that as a woman I do X, Y, and Z? And when we begin to be more intentional about our behavior,
Mm-hmm.
about our actions, we begin to restory our life, live life on our own terms.
Right.
And it's a process for anyone. I chose women because, number one, I am a woman,
Mm-hmm.
and there's just a different layer that women have to uncover.
Right. Okay. So, okay, you work with you get these women through the process, and and they're changing their story. What do you want the result to be for them?
I want the result to be for women to be able to live life on their own terms. Just plain and simple. To be able to have your own intention and your own purpose for doing what it is that you want to do. To be able to feel comfortable in a meeting and being able to speak your mind. Being able to contribute without having to feel like you're being disempowered or downplayed. Being able to take agency over your presence in any environment. And that is something that society has just not allowed women to do en masse. For us to feel like we have agency, we have the authority and the control to do what it is that we want to do. And so I want women to get into that position where they tap into their own personal power, that they feel like they have the agency and the authority to not ask for permission, but to serve damn notice that this is what I'm going to do, and feel okay about that.
Okay, so with that, earlier in the conversation, we pointed out, like you said, Thurgood Marshall, Kamala Harris.
Mm-hmm.
We can rattle down the entire list, but
Mm-hmm.
the thing of it is, we're pointing out isolated people.
Exactly.
instead of people as a norm.
Exactly. Exactly. That's exactly my point.
Mhm.
So I don't want to have to say here are two or three women that have done it. The same example we gave for the basketball players. The same example we
Right.
gave. I want women to get. I want to change this. My mission is to dismantle, deconstruct the patriarchal system.
Right.
So, and one story at a time, one at a time, but not to get rid of these isolated cases. That there is, one woman, and it may not be another one for the next 50 years. Who knows? But to get to a point where that women do not have to live through the experience of Katanji or Kamala, or any of the other, trailblazers,
Right.
that they look at that as it's supposed to be.
Is it fair to say that you want to turn the trail, change the trail from being just a single path to being a mass highway?
Yes, I love it. I love that imagery. Listen, a mass highway with traffic jams.
That's it.
I love that imagery. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
I love that imagery. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a matter of and I'm not the only person, who has this on there, particularly for women of color. My mentors have been Bell Hooks and Audrey Lloyd and Toni K. Barrett, and all of us, believe it or not, have had to use like literature, story, and poetry, as our stage of protest and rebellion.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, and so I'm not the trailblazer in this. I feel honored to carry on the torch, and I know from their work that we have more women who are stepping up, into the space. That but for women of color, it takes us a lot longer because we still have that double-edged sword. We still have the blessing of being, women of color and being women.
Right.
So we still have both things. But as we know from women's suffrage, that the worst thing in the world in a patriarchal society is to be a woman. So when you get past, for black women, even when we get past the hurdle of racism, we
Mhm.
still have to deal with the hurdle of being a woman in a patriarchal society.
Yeah. No. Okay. Because we both remember affirmative action, right?
Oh,
The,
we grew up in it.
yeah. Yeah. Tick marks. It's like um, and I never paid it that that much attention, but there were I remember being in a conversation with a another man, another man of color, as a matter of fact, and he said, "Yeah, well, she had all the advantages because they can tick off more boxes because they hired her." I was like, "You really think that's the reason why she got the job over you? You don't think it's because she could do a better job?"
So my question would be is, why do you have to have the boxes? Because if you didn't
Oh
have
yeah,
boxes that needed to be checked, she wouldn't even be there.
right. It wouldn't matter. It would be just two
Yes,
people going against it, going
yes,
for the same job, right?
yes, yes, exactly. And
And
so
that was
because, and
what.
that tells you that there were some prior practices before that
Right.
affirmative action was addressing. Which, by the way, so you want to know this, and I know you know this. The hot button at that time was off the heels of the civil rights movement, right?
Yes,
Remember the
right.
hot button? And so we had all these affirmative acts. I'm thankful for it because it came down to a Brooklyn um, city and plucked me out and put me in a in a university, and I was able to go from there. But then after about what 10, 15 years, you started seeing legislation, Baki. You started seeing legislation that was overturning affirmative action. So it
Right.
was in a heyday for a number of years, but you don't even hear the word anymore. The word is not even,
Well,
you don't even hear the
well,
word anymore,
I,
affirmative
I,
action. Unless
I,
you talk to some,
yeah, I had to dig back a
that's
number
what
of
I'm saying.
years, right?
But that
But
was
the thing
supposed to
is,
have been a change in social structure, and it wasn't. It was a buzzword, and I'm not down it because a lot of things happen, and particularly for me in terms of getting access to areas that I would not have gotten access to. But when it was done, it was done. And now we see the same thing happening in result to George Floyd, the new affirmative action movement. So you have people
mhm,
now. The new buzzword I think is not affirmative action. I think it's called diversity, equity, and inclusion. So you have companies now who are really on a DEI trail, and this is the new thing. How do we get people? And I'm wondering, coming out of corporate, I'm just wondering how long will this activity last? Because it's in response to some horrible incidents that shows the face,
yeah.
um, of this country.
Well, it left all these things that left me with thinking that I have a responsibility, and you can disagree with me or not on this one. That I have a responsibility after that door closes behind me. I have a responsibility to get to a point where I am able to go open that door back up again or open the window. Hey, come on guys, let's go, right?
Mhm. But what
And
if
that's
the
what I
story
like to
then
see
becomes?
about the end of affirmative action was that somebody
Mhm,
was able to open the window.
mhm, yeah. So what if you were? What if the story you were told that, hey, when you get in there, you got to look out for yourself because if they find out, with that story that you're told about not collaboration, not pulling in, that that you need to take care of you. You need to get what you
Well,
can get. You can, we don't control it, so we take advantage of it. I watch those types of stories play themselves out,
mhm,
which is some of the same thing that women say now that when women started going to corporations, it was the expectation that you would reach back and get other women, and that wasn't happening. It's like no, I am now
yeah,
going to act like the environment in which I am working in. And so
right.
you started having these sidebar stories about how difficult it is for a woman to work with another woman. Um, what's the social responsibility
Yeah,
of us
yeah.
getting,
Well,
one person getting a position? What is that? So those are all the things that you have to start looking at. You can't assume
mhm,
that a person who, because you take on the story of the culture that you're invested in. And so when you go to corporate, you start to look at how much control do you have? Did you ever watch the Spook Who Step Out the Door
no,
by Sam Greenlee? Okay, it's a
no, I've been
movie that
told
talks about
that.
that. When you go in, like, what is your responsibility, and how much control do you have? A lot of times people will say, "Well, I'm going to open the door." Well, your managerial little box may not even allow you to be near a door. You may not talk to anyone. You
Uh
come
huh.
there, they have your head down, and that's all you know. Now what you might do is come out and teach people, like, what did you learn office politics wise? But you may not be able to open the door in that company because you may not be nowhere near there or have access, but you can come out and teach what you were learning so that others might have an idea as to how to go and behave or get ahead when another door opens somewhere else.
Right. Now that makes sense.
And I say that because I in my neighborhood, my immediate neighborhood, the group of kids that graduated with me, we were like some of the first to go to college. My parents were from the Gulf of Sea Islands and Haiti, and so pretty much treated like little immigrants up in New York, and thinking that we didn't have much, we wasn't worth much, but they valued education, and so that when I thought that I was going to go back and get this education, educate the whole community,
Yeah.
and that wasn't possible. But what I understood my responsibility was, like I'm doing now, is that when I learned how to do something differently that would give me a positive result, I take that back to my community.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so all of them did not get entrance into, universities, but they all understood the power of education. What I learned about finances, how do you keep your money in your community? So what are those things that you learn from the outside that's going to benefit your community? That those are things that I was taught from my father to bring back. And even though I may not have opened the door, I got people prepared for doors that may become available to them.
Yeah, that was you just said something that keeping the finances and the money within the community. And that is something that, again, going back to those who want to control versus those who are being controlled, that we're taught as those who are being controlled that we're not allowed to keep the money within our community, that we have to take the money back to a different community.
See, that's the story you were told.
Right. Yeah, see that's the story.
That's the story. And so when you understand, first of all, you asked about the process earlier, and the first process, of course, is self-awareness. And part of that self-awareness is not only to listen to the stories that you were told, but to challenge the stories. Okay? And that's where I begin to get people to really say, wait a minute. So when I tell you that, how can we challenge the story? And what is one of the golden rules that you don't challenge God, you don't challenge authority, you don't challenge this? Well, when you talk to me, I say challenge everything. Because as a storyteller, I know that there's more than two sides to a story. There is as many sides as many people who tell the story. So depending upon who's telling you the story, you get a different spin on it. So my thing is, you always look at the story that you're being told and to see where you are in it, and can see where you can change it.
Right.
And that's where it comes. So that when the way that I was told the story about not taking money out of our community, that's not what I was told. So I always challenge that. I always challenge that. And you challenge that by, number one, like I said, questioning it. And then looking at how other people are telling the story, the same story. How many times is it being told differently? Look at other cultures. How are they telling the story? Look at, so when you take yourself out of just this one narrative, you can begin to think differently. And that is why it's important to me that I get women not to just look at one narrative defining who we are.
Yeah. Okay. So we are gonna start to run out of time soon here. What is the story that you want our society to live?
The story that I want is in my name, femininely free. I want a society where we no longer suppress the feminine. And I don't mean just women, but I mean feminine. So that when we look at collaboration, when we look at intuition, when we look at love, when we look at, caring, when we look at peace, all these things that are considered to be on the feminine realm side. I want us to be in a society where all of them are equal. There are times when we need to be aggressive. You know, there are
Mm-hmm.
times, but I want us to be a part to where they're equal,
Right.
and that even though one gender, you know, may have more than the other, that gender is not marginalized because they have an overabundance of feminine energy.
Mm-hmm.
But nor do I want men who are still masculine, but that may show some feminine tendencies not to be, you know, ridiculed
Right.
as being soft. I want it to a point where masculine and feminine are on equal balances.
Okay. What are the best ways to find femininely free?
Femininely Free is a mission that would like to change the status of women one story at a time so that we become a collective narrative
Mm-hmm.
of who we are.
Right. Best ways to find you and work with you?
If somebody wants to work with me, they can contact me at femininelyfree.com, www.femininelyfree.com, or I'm also on LinkedIn, Saundra Gilliard, you know my name. And